Okay, great. So can everyone yeah, see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up. Make sure it's okay. Yep, awesome. Thanks, guys. All right, beautiful. So, yeah, as you probably know, so tonight's topic is essentially how much weight can I expect to lose? So, I find I know I get this question quite often. So, I'm sure most of you that have joined in tonight will have essentially a similar question. So, the answer to that is it depends. So, hopefully, with yeah, a bit of understanding, essentially, the basics of how our body works. We'll be focusing essentially on metabolism. So I hope to give you tonight, just some essentially some nuggets to walk away with, or at least get the thought process going, or just to give you a bit of reassurance as well. I find that having that understanding can help to manage, your expectations, and essentially yeah, not be at the end of the day, not be too hard on yourselves, along this journey. Beautiful. So let's get into it. So, as mentioned, we're going to start off by just discussing what metabolism is. So, I know we hear that word obviously so often. It's a bit of a catchphrase that's sort of thrown around here or there. So, I thought I'd essentially note down how I generally like to describe it. So, as seen on the screen here, so your metabolism encompasses all the chemical processes continuously occurring in. Oh, sorry, did I unshare myself? Can you still see my screen? No, I unshared. Sorry, everyone. Let me go back. All right, awesome. Yeah, so essentially, it's yeah, your metabolism encompasses all the chemical processes that are continuously occurring in your body just to sustain your life, to keep you alive, essentially. So to give you, I suppose, a metaphor for it, think of it as your body's engine. So just like a car engine takes fuel and converts it to energy to essentially make the car go forward and backwards. We do the same. So we take food as our energy and we transform it into, again, moving our body, but also things like, repairing your cells, growing new ones, keeping your heart beating, maintaining your body temperature, powering your brain, digesting food, and fighting illness. So part of obviously, your immune system as well. So that's essentially what your metabolism is. Now, the next two things I've noted down here, they're just more, FYI, just a little sort of interesting sort of tidbit. But essentially, your body is or your metabolism is split into two different types of reaction. So on the left here, we have catabolism. So essentially, that's breaking things down. So funnily enough, we actually do need a little bit of energy to break down food. So I'll touch on that in a moment. But we do break things down so we can use it for energy. And then we have anabolism. So that's the part of our metabolism that's part of building. So as you can see there, so building and repairing tissues, that includes muscles and bones, essentially that your body needs to function. So yeah, I just mentioned that that's something a little bit interesting. And depending on largely your point in life, your body tends to favor one slightly more than the other. So essentially, when we're younger, we are more on the anabolism side. We're growing, we're building, essentially needing a lot more energy. As we start to age, naturally, things start to break down. So we somewhat favor the catabolism side of things. However, in saying that, there's lots of things that we can do, and it's not as drastic as what I've made it out to be. But these are things that influence ultimately our metabolism. And down the bottom here, I've noted that metabolism isn't a single speed. So essentially, your metabolism changes over your lifetime, so decade to decade, but also day to day, hour to hour. So our metabolism is never working at one speed. There's so many influences to it that essentially change it. So as mentioned, it's a dynamic, responsive system that adjusts based on what you eat, how you move, how you sleep, and your hormonal environment. Awesome. Cool. All right. So fantastic. All right. I've lost everyone on the screen. So I normally sort of look at people to see if people are confused or going along. So I think I've got some people back. So I'm sort of judging on, yeah, if you're keeping up. But I'll just pause here. Obviously, we'll get into this a little bit more, but any questions at this point? No? Beautiful. All right. Fantastic. We'll keep going. Awesome. So, essentially, moving on from there, what determines our metabolic rate? So, essentially, your metabolic rate is the speed at which your body uses energy. Or in other words, essentially how many or how quickly you burn kilojoules slash calories. And generally, we calculate that on a daily average or daily basis. So we've got a little bit of a graph here on the left-hand side. The biggest part of what makes up our metabolic rate is what we call our basal metabolic rate. So if you've had a body composition scan at Alivia and you look at the printout, there should be, yeah, there's a section that has BMR. So we can measure it, through sort of electrical current. It does take essentially a bit of all your results and spits out the number. But yeah, that is pretty close to accurate. But essentially, what your basal metabolic rate is the minimum energy you need for life-sustaining functions at rest. So even if you're lying down in bed, essentially you're burning calories because obviously we're still breathing. I've noted circulation there, but that's essentially keeping your heart pumping. You're always repairing and building cells, your brain activity, temperature regulation. So essentially, your base there will everyone will have a baseline. The next slide, I'll sort of put a microscope to that and break that up a little bit more. The next part, what determines our metabolic rate is exercise, and I'll lump them together. So we have exercise, and the one below is NEAT. So basically, what that is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So those two have been clumped together, and that's under your activity. So that 25% on that graph there. So essentially, exercise is your planned physical activity. So essentially, getting the heart rate up, lifting heavy things. That's essentially what exercise encompasses. And then your NEAT, as noted there, is energy used for everything that isn't sleeping, eating, or structured exercise. So we more know that as your incidental activity. So that can be just going for leisurely strolls. Like myself, obviously, have an office-based job. I try and do as I preach. So even in between, sort of clients, standing up, sitting down, fidgeting, all of those things contribute to essentially your NEAT or your incidental activity. If we break that down a little bit more, so if we sort of break down that 25%, essentially exercise is going to be about 5 to 10%. And I know that's sort of a bit contradictory to what we believe. But the reason for that is exercise, for the most part, we can only sustain it for a short period of time. So, most classes may be 45 minutes, to an hour, for example. And because it is, relatively intense, whether that be on the cardiovascular system or on our muscles, if it's more resistance training based, we need some recovery. So unless we're, I suppose elite athletes, where essentially it is your job to exercise, most of us, are on average getting to the gym maybe anywhere between 2 to 5 days, a week. So essentially, yeah, there are some days where we're not exercising. Whereas with your NEAT exercise or your incidental activity, that is something that we can do on a daily basis. We don't need to recover from it, and it's something that we can sustain, for a longer period of time. So, but there are a lot of research studies that have looked into, okay, with your incidental activity, is it best to do it all in one hit? So go for an hour walk, or does breaking it up, 10 minutes randomly across the day, does that count as well? And you'll be happy to know it all contributes. So it doesn't matter if you do it in one long hit or, yeah, you take 10, a couple of minutes, a couple of times a day. Even, yeah, I try and sort of get up from my seat, do a couple of squats, sit back down, get the body moving. So all of those things contribute to your metabolic rate. Beautiful. And then the last little tiny bit is the thermic effect of food. So, as I know this sounds a bit silly, but essentially we do actually burn energy digesting and absorbing food. So I will mention that's a whole topic on its on its own. But to put it very, very, very broadly, essentially, I suppose focusing on more of your whole food. So your lean proteins, your high fiber foods, your nutrient dense foods, essentially, they take the most energy to absorb. So, for example, there was actually a really recent study where they looked at nuts, and it sort of, yeah, rethought our thinking. So essentially, what us as dietitians thought is that a handful of almonds, so about 30 grams, which is around sort of 20 to 25 almonds, we were under the, sort of under the impression that it has, depending on, the size of the nuts, but between sort of 150 to 180 calories. But some of those calories are negated because 30% of that goes to actually burning and digesting the calories. So the net calories you end up actually getting from nuts is closer to 130, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's recently new. So I'm sure there's a lot more that's going to come up, in that area of research. But essentially, it's something that we've known about for a while. But the ins and outs of it, where we're not, I suppose, unsure of on particular types of food. So I'm sure that's sort of coming, in the future. So essentially, that's what makes up your metabolic rate. So the next slide, I'll go into the your basal metabolic rate. So just before we do, essentially your basal metabolic rate, so sort of that 60 to 70% of your metabolism is something that we can't address on a day-to-day basis, and this will make sense in the next slide. It's more adaptive to long-term changes. Whereas, obviously, with your exercise, your incidental activity, and the food that you're eating, obviously, they're things that we can target more on a day-to-day basis. So it'll make a little bit more sense just as I flip over now. So, oops, sorry, I was actually meant to take this slide out because I condensed it down into this one, so my mistake. So these are key factors that influence your basal metabolic rate. So the first one being your lean body mass. So essentially, a big part of that is your muscles, but it actually also encompasses your bones and organs. So essentially, it's everything in your body that isn't fat or fluid. So that's basically what your lean body mass is. And essentially, the more muscle mass you have, generally your basal metabolic rate may sit higher to someone who is exactly, the same age, same, same sex, same height and weight. But if your weight is determined by being higher in muscle mass and lower in fat mass, your basal metabolic rate will sit higher than the next person. So essentially, that's why, exercise is very important, not only for, the calories that it burns right there and then, but it's more so for the long-term effect, building muscle mass and how that can help to contribute, to your basal metabolic rate, essentially making, weight loss. Again, the weight loss part of it may not be addressed or we can't influence it right away, but the more muscle mass that you develop over time, the easier it may be to maintain your weight moving forward. So that's one determining factor. The next is genetics, your sex, and age. So essentially, your baseline, so your basal metabolic rate is partly inherited. So males typically have a higher BMR than females, largely due to naturally having greater lean muscle or lean body mass. Your BMR does decrease essentially as the decades pass. But as you can see here, it's not as, I suppose, dire as what is sort of made out to be. So it really sort of decreases by 1 to 2% per decade, purely just based on age. Obviously, there's more influences here. But yes, obviously, technically, as you age, your basal metabolic rate does naturally start to decrease. And again, I suppose more on the broader genetic side of things is some people just naturally have a slightly higher or lower BMR. And again, this is largely outside of your control. But again, as I mentioned there, it doesn't mean that your metabolism is fixed. And as I mentioned earlier, variation exists. So, two people in the exact same, sort of age, again, height, weight, even if, muscle mass and fat mass was largely the same, we then have to consider your hormonal environment as well. So again, one person's basal metabolic rate may be completely different to the next, even though the most obvious things may seem similar. So the next thing that plays a big role, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, is the hormonal environment. So again, this is a whole topic on its own, but essentially, to name a few, your thyroid hormones, insulin, cortisol, your reproductive hormones, they all have a part in influencing your metabolism. And absolutely, obviously, it can be hormonal function can be affected by medical conditions. It can, chronic long-term stress, sleep quality, your activity levels, and nutrition as well, play a part in that. And then lastly, we have, energy availability. So that's essentially what energy availability means is how much fuel you consistently provide your body. So one thing that you may, or I receive a lot of questions about, I suppose it's known sort of colloquially as starvation mode. So I suppose it's not the most accurate way to describe it, but I suppose the mechanisms are absolutely true. So basically, what that means is when calorie intake drops significantly or stays low, for an extended period of time, essentially the body adapts and slows the metabolic processes, essentially to keep your reserves elevated. At the end of the day, your body wants to keep you alive. So if, alarms are flashing, reserves are getting low and you're not able to replenish those reserves, adequately, then basically your body will readjust its metabolism to preserve, your energy levels essentially and your reserves. So that is something that can happen. But we'll touch on that as well and what that looks like a little bit more practically. So yeah, as mentioned earlier, just that little light bulb down the bottom. So BMR is adaptive, but not necessarily manipulated day to day. So it only responds to sustained patterns. Again, not a single meal, workout, or short-term change will have a big effect on your BMR. Awesome. All right. So any questions? So far. No? Okay, beautiful. Awesome. So just a little, again, nothing that you need to remember in great detail, but I always like to explain the inner workings. So essentially, this is how your metabolic rate is calculated. So as you can see here, these are three of the main calculations that we use as doctors and dietitians. As you can see there, the one that we use most often is the one in the middle. So, and as you can see, these were created in the first one was in 1919. It was revised in 1984. We've got, the one, I suppose the newest one, I should say. Sorry, the word's not coming to me, but the most current is the Mifflin equation there. And then the Schofield. So the Schofield we don't use on a individual level. It's more for population. But essentially, what these calculations have in common, which is just down the bottom there, they all use body weight, height, age, and sex as proxies to understand lean body mass and your organ size as well. So a big thing I wanted to mention here is that they are estimates. So they don't account for, again, individual variation in body composition. That's where the body composition scan is really helpful and gives us a little bit more accuracy. Whereas with these equations, as mentioned, it's just those numbers used as proxies. But with the body composition scan, we actually can get those readings and those numbers a little bit more accurate. But what we can't calculate is, again, your hormonal status and your genetics. So unfortunately, that can't be, I suppose, put into an equation. So whether you've gone through, this process yourself in calculating, your basal metabolic rate, or in the next slide, we'll talk about what maintenance calories are. you calculate it all. Anything, when we sort of add a little bit more to it to come up with our maintenance calories, anything below that is considered, a calorie deficit and should, on paper, result in weight loss. But, we may not, even dietitians, doctors, we may not get it right, right from the get-go because we may have overestimated, underestimated. So really the only way that we can be accurate is to actually give it a go, yeah, in real life, essentially. So having a starting point, trying with those, particular calories, and then once we get a bit of feedback as to, a month has passed, what's the body doing, and then we can readjust, from there. So I more just wanted to mention that because I know it seemed, yeah, it's absolutely confusing, sort of doing it on your own. But even us as, again, dietitians and doctors, we don't get it right 100% of the time because we can't calculate, I suppose, these things that aren't measurable. So it does take a little bit of adaptation. Beautiful. So, um, perfect. So now, what we have spoken to right up until this point has been your basal metabolic rate. So essentially, we've just calculated so far how many calories you need just to keep your body alive, essentially. Obviously, everyone here, I assume we're not in bed 24/7. So, we do have some activity in our day. And that is what is called your total daily expenditure when we times your basal metabolic rate by what we call a physical activity factor. So essentially, we've got a few that we can sort of choose from, but even these factors, they're, I suppose, relatively arbitrary, and it's a bit of clinical judgment that comes into them. So as you can see, under the numbers in bold, there's a multiplier. So in the sedentary, there's 1.2. In the lightly active is 1.375, and I've done the same for the last one. Essentially, the 1.2, all the information it gives us is not very active. So essentially, sort of you wake up, go about your, how your duties, sit down all day in an office. Maybe, you might work out a couple of times a week. So that's sort of more on the inactive side of things. But then the next one, it goes into slightly active. And all it says is that you exercise 1 to 3 times a week. So obviously massive room, massive room to move. And again, what does that mean in terms of steps? How long are you spending at the gym? How intense are your workouts? So, there's a lot of room to move between these multipliers. Again, yeah, making it can be very difficult to get it right, at the start. But essentially, that's how we work out your total daily expenditure, or otherwise known as your maintenance calories. So they're essentially the calories that you need to eat to neither gain nor lose weight, essentially to maintain. So as mentioned earlier, yeah, any number below that it is considered a calorie deficit, and again, on paper, should have an outcome of weight loss. Um, Although it's not I suppose, the topic for this evening, but essentially to build muscle mass, you actually need to be in a calorie surplus. So I know that's not sort of the goal of most people here at the moment, potentially in the future, but essentially to build that muscle, we need to give our body a little bit more energy to help promote that building side of things. But again, that's just more a little bit of a FYI. So what I've done here just to, illustrate, and I'm so sorry when I put this together, it sort of muddled the order I wanted it in, but essentially, what have we got? Yep, beautiful. So as we can see here, I've kept basically female the same, 52 years old, 160 centimeters. So that's consistent. The things that I have changed is what current weight. So I've done 80 kilos versus 100 kilos, and physical activity levels. So as you can see here, they all come out with slightly different numbers. So essentially, the more sedentary at a lower weight, as we can see here, your basal metabolic rate is sitting at 1,359 as an example. If we have Yep, sorry, and those two numbers should be the same. Like I said, sorry, it's muddled it up. But basically, if we times that by, a physical activity level, as we can see, which you can see through here, even the numbers might not be accurate, but essentially, if you're more sedentary, your maintenance calories are going to be a lot lower compared to someone who's, again, has exactly the same, considerations, but is slightly more active. So as you can see, as you can see here, your maintenance calories sit higher. Then on the far sort of right side here, we've got someone sitting at a slightly higher weight. As you can see, your basal metabolic rate is higher, and therefore you're and lightly active and maintenance calories, as you can see comparatively, are a lot higher compared to those that are sitting at a lower weight. So it's more just to demonstrate that, these factors absolutely, play a part, but because they're so variable and take a bit of judgment to get right, there can be that trial and error. And I more so say that again, I commonly hear, I've tried everything and it hasn't worked. Sometimes it's just that calculation that needs, a little bit of adjustment. And that's obviously where, we're here to support. Beautiful. All right. Awesome. So, okay, so yeah, these are just, I just wanted to add this in. So essentially, these are common metabolism myths that, look, I suppose I hear them so often, through social media, and subsequently, I chat about them in my consultations. So first one being, eating small, frequent meal boosts metabolism. So essentially, meal frequency has minimal impact on metabolic rate. It is more on your total daily intake that matters the most as opposed to timing. So I'm also mentioned that because a lot of people come in stressed, like what should I be doing? When should I be eating? Essentially, that comes down to what is comfortable for you, what is practical, what fits into your work and your home life schedule. Are you someone that generally has, a more, I suppose, active appetite, that you may need to sort of eat a little bit more frequently to keep that at bay? Are there particular times of the day where you're not feeling particularly hungry? So that can be a smaller meal and then essentially get more nutrition at other meals. So there's so many considerations, but at the end of the day, it does not matter what your day looks like. It could be completely different to the next. But what matters in your weight loss journey is just your overall calories consumed over the whole day. The next one is certain foods have negative calories. So I just wanted to mention no food requires more energy to digest it than it provides. So basically, the thermic effect is always just a fraction of what of what energy it provides. I will say though, I might be guilty of saying, treating things as free foods. So potentially, if we've been in a consultation together, I may have said this, but essentially, they're your non-starchy vegetables. So because they are very low calorie, they absolutely still contribute, to your calorie intake. But because they're very low, I usually don't give a particular, sort of weight or portion with them. Essentially, if you're filling up your plate with veggies, it's going to have a very minimal impact on your overall sort of calorie intake. So I just in case someone catches me out, I wanted to get there before potentially. But essentially, yes, they still contribute to your calories, but over the whole day, fairly inconsequential. Beautiful. A slow metabolism is the main cause of weight gain. So I will say there is some, truth to that. I suppose the most common is those that have polycystic ovary syndrome, even menopause to some degree. So again, all these things they do impact your overall metabolism, but at the end of the day, find a calorie deficit will help in your journey with weight loss. Where the art comes in is actually finding what your calorie deficit is. And again, that might take a bit of trial and error because, again, there are some things that we can't calculate for or take into consideration. And they have absolutely tried, to like they have the physical activity factor. They've tried to find, okay, in women with polycystic ovary syndrome, what disadvantage are they at, metabolism wise, and how can we, include that into a particular equation. but it's so, so variable that it's hard, yeah, to find, the middle ground. So again, there's so much individual variation where, yeah, it takes a little bit of, yeah, of experience to understand what that looks like for you. And then dieting permanently damages your metabolism. So, good news is there is very minimal things that you can do, if any, that can permanently change your metabolism. The good news is, yeah, hopefully, as you've discovered, your metabolism is always adapting. So even if you do get to the stage where you have been in a significant calorie deficit, for a, genuinely long time, and absolutely your metabolism has adjusted to that to the point where, 1,200 calories is not doing the trick and you're not losing weight, that is absolutely a reality. But the great thing is the way that we can, yeah, help the body essentially readapt is actually go in, yeah, eat closer towards your maintenance calories. So it's your metabolism starts to regulate itself. It starts to essentially, for lack of a better term, increase. It starts to speed up, and then making, sort of another attempt at a calorie deficit, helping to get, yeah, that weight off, again. So again, that's something that we, yeah, us as dietitians, we talk about quite frequently and can support with. But yeah, good news is that, yeah, generally, it's always adapting and there are always things that we can do either in the short term. Some things might take a little bit longer, but it's always adapting. So there is always hope, is what I say. Beautiful. All right. So, perfect. So we're going to, yeah, move away, I suppose ever so slightly from metabolism, more just around, yeah, how weight loss actually works. Again, I'll just check in any questions so far at this point. No, beautiful. All right, fantastic. So, perfect. So essentially, what does that all, what does that all mean? So, what I tend to describe is with we've worked out your maintenance calories, let's just say. Essentially, what we aim for, I know I mentioned that any number below that is considered a calorie deficit. Practically speaking, we aim for roughly a 500 calorie deficit per day because we see it in practice, but also it's been researched quite frequently in that it's sort of a bit of a happy medium where you can notice somewhat significant grounds made with your weight loss journey, but it's not so significant to the point where you're left hungry essentially and not, I suppose going into a calorie deficit that is so significant that, you're actually not even able to get all the nutrients that you need. So we tend to find on average about a 500 calorie deficit a day is a good place to start. And the reason where that sort of comes from is that essentially, um, half a kilo of of fat on our body. If you think of a stick of butter, that's essentially what 500 grams of of fat looks like on us. But it takes 3,000. It's holding 3,500 calories. So essentially, if we, yeah, on paper, if we aim for a 500 calorie deficit per day over 7 days, that's 3,500 calories. So on paper, it should result in about half a kilo of weight loss per week. So that's just, again, sort of a bit of a starting point. If your maintenance calories are on the lower side, a 500 calorie deficit may be, quite difficult to achieve. So your expected rate of weight loss may be a little bit different compared to someone who's either a little bit more active or is actually sitting at a higher weight, where their basal metabolic rate, again, because of body composition, is naturally sitting a little bit higher, or their energy needs are higher because of their physical activity level. So therefore, it'll make it a little bit easier to get into a calorie deficit, if that, yeah, hopefully if that makes sense. But even in saying this to, yeah, to people, I am very cognizant that, again, like working out, your basal metabolic rate, like working out your, your maintenance calories. This is also just an equation, and it doesn't take into account the realities of how our body works. So essentially, the only way that we would consistently see half a kilo of weight loss per week on the scales is if our body was static. So, again, our metabolism is changing hour to hour, day to day, because it depends, on some days you may have moved, may have done a bit more steps. You may have actually gone to the gym that day. Or you may have been more, more sedentary, even compared to a work day. You may have, sort of been in bed for half the day. So, also the types of foods that you're eating, all of these things manipulate your metabolism. So, essentially, we know on paper, it's not going to come out as you're going to lose half a kilo a week. It's more over a period of time. When we average it, then we sort of see that movement. So one week you might actually, if we're weighing yourself week to week, you may actually not lose anything. You may have stayed stable for one week. The next week you might actually go down, 700 grams. The next week it might be 200. The week after it might be nothing, but the week after that you might go down, a kilo. So yeah, unfortunately, our body doesn't like to work in a linear fashion, which makes it very unpredictable, which can be really, really, really frustrating. I completely understand. So that's where I usually tell people, if you are weighing yourself daily, essentially the fluctuations, that you're noticing on the scales are mostly just going to be fluid fluctuations. So we have some control over that, as to, how much fluid obviously we purposely consume. But beyond that, it's up to our body to maintain, our fluid levels. So again, that can be dictated by, have we eaten, a bit more salt today? Have we had a bit more electrolytes through our food? Are we retaining a bit more fluid? So, that's, I suppose, somewhat in our control, largely not. Um, I'm sorry for this example, but your bowel movements. And I actually did an experiment today. So I weighed myself when I got to Olivia this morning. I had had breakfast. I had a coffee. I weighed myself. I was, where was I sitting? 81 point, I think 81.1. And then at the end of the day, or yeah, later on in the day, I will admit, today was a bit of a lighter day on the food for me, but it was a perfect example because I purposely or yeah, didn't have a lot for lunch because I wanted to see, okay, I've just had breakfast. How does my weight change, by actually not consuming, anything? I did have water and I had a coffee. And I stepped on the scales and I was 80.5. So as you can see, your weight changes, easily by, and day to day, it can change by a kilo, if not more. And that was just a couple of hours. I used exactly the same, exactly the same scales. I was obviously wearing the exact same thing. So yeah, your weight can fluctuate quite a lot, day to day. So if you're weighing yourself daily, it can sort of muddy the water and not give you a true, sort of progress report. So generally what I recommend is to weigh yourself, weekly or fortnightly. And then you can, I suppose, take a bit of a step back, see the bird's eye view and actually see, where the trend is going. So yeah, beautiful.
I'm
So
glad you've told us what you want.
yeah,
I'm
I
really
know,
pleased because I thought I'm
yeah,
struggling at the moment, and I
yeah,
thought I was wondering what you weighed, and I thought
yeah,
she couldn't weigh that much, and I thought you weigh more than I thought you did,
yeah, yeah. And
and
look,
then so I thought
absolutely.
to myself, that's a bit of incentive to me now.
Yeah, and there you go. You can't, and it's really hard, to tell or predict people's weight just by
Yeah,
what they look
very
like.
hard to pick anyone's weight.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you
Absolutely.
said 80.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I suppose, it's obviously it's different. I'm pretty, I find I'm a pretty open person. If you've had a chat to me, I know sometimes I can get pretty chatty. Obviously just with the, yeah, the talk tonight. But yeah, I'm happy to share, I suppose even, yeah, a lot of the doctors, myself, we even talk about our own, weight loss, weight gain, weight loss, journeys. So, yeah, I tend to find that's one of the great things about Olivia is that, for the
How
most
tall
part,
are you?
I am 169
Oh,
centimeters.
you're quite tall, so you don't look.
Yeah.
I'm quite
Yeah.
short, and
Yeah.
that you're lucky.
Yeah. Yeah. But look, again, weight is, I always say, it is a number. It's not
Yeah.
obviously the most important, thing. There's so many other things that contribute to our health. But yeah, I like to be open because we're here to support, support you.
Well, it's
Beautiful.
good because I was wondering what you weigh because you look
Yeah.
slim today, and I
Yeah.
think You're
Yeah.
probably on the heavier side for a dietitian, so I thought that's good.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
really
look,
good.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We all come in different, yeah, yeah,
We all come
different
in
body.
different, as you said, we come in different sizes, and you can't
Absolutely.
tell who's
Yep.
um, like that. And I said to her, I've been having a couple
Yeah.
of really bad days. So Julie
Mm.
said, go and do support and go and do
Yep.
counselling. I've just found out your that, so it's lifted me a bit now.
Yeah, great. Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm really glad that helped. Yeah,
Yeah, it
awesome. So
does.
beautiful. So yeah, so essentially, yeah, sort of discussing, that, yeah, that journey. So just to put a little bit more information into that. So essentially, as well, on, yeah, what's on the scale is that you're not also just losing fat. So again, as I mentioned, there's water. If you are eating slightly less carbohydrates as well as, most of you may have, yeah, may have heard, when we eat carbohydrates, we store some water alongside it, which is absolutely, yeah, true. So if we slightly decrease, the carbohydrate intake, some of that initial loss that you may see might actually just be a bit of water, yeah, water weight that has been previously stored. And I will mention, I suppose it's a big, big topic of conversation across the board, but we do anticipate that there will be some loss of lean tissue or muscle, essentially because we're in a calorie deficit. Our body is moving more towards that catabolic, so breaking, things down. So there will be a little bit of muscle loss, but obviously our yeah attempt is to preserve your muscle mass and then later on down the track rebuild. Beautiful. So again, I've mentioned your body does adapt to sort of prolonged restriction. So what your yeah, your restriction may be at point A after a period of time might actually not be your restriction. You might actually just be then eating at your maintenance calories. So it always needs a bit of adjustment. And then, yeah, which I've mentioned there. So the same deficit produces less weight loss over time. Again, your hormones, gut health, sleep quality, stress all influence, yeah, energy storage, essentially your metabolic rate. And exercise alone. So let me just check the time. Beautiful. I want to make sure we've got some time at the end. But essentially, yeah, I do hear quite often where, Steph, I've increased my physical activity a lot. I'm not seeing any movement on the scales. So I suppose that what where that comes from is essentially you may have gone for maybe one more walk, or you may have even started going to the gym. So basically with yeah, your metabolic rate, if we go back to that yeah, the graph before, it yeah, it takes up, about 25%. So essentially, and everybody's obviously different as to how they react. But I looked back at some of my, yeah, when I was during COVID, had not a lot to do. I was one of those people that went for runs. Now I can't even fathom, yeah, walking, walking 5 kilometers, let alone running. But I had a look, yeah, at my stats, and look, it's wildly, sort of inaccurate, I will mention, but yeah, I was like, okay, I went for a half an hour run. There was only about 300 calories. So, really, I won't know, total calorie output unless we measure sort of the carbon dioxide that we, if you're hooked up to a massive machine. But yeah, so those tracking, they can be out by about 20%. Don't get me wrong, but essentially, yeah, as you can see, going for a half an hour run, that took me so much effort. It was only 300 calories. I could so easily eat that, a chocolate bar or a muesli bar is 300 calories. So even though you're, yeah, increasing your exercise, it can easily be negated by having, having that little bit too much. So I generally tend to say exercise is for all the other benefits. So essentially helping preserve your muscle mass, your bone density. If we get your heart rate up, it helps to with your cardiovascular health. So all those benefits that contribute to our health. But when we look at exercise just through the lens of weight loss, it only plays a small part. So I just wanted to mention that yes, it is important. Yes, it does contribute, but maybe a way to think of it is I suppose the more active you are, the easier it is to get into a calorie deficit. So to aim, to lose that sort of half a kilo or to get into a 500 calorie deficit, if you're metabolic rate, or sorry, your maintenance calories are, 2000 because of how active you are, then a deficit is about 1500 compared to if you weren't active, maybe your maintenance calories are 1000, 600, let's just say. So to get that same, weight loss, you would have to essentially have, 1000, what would that be? Yeah, 1000 sort of 600. You're at 1000, yeah, 600. So if we take away five, it's roughly around, 1100 calories, which is pretty low. So hopefully that puts it into, a little bit of perspective. Awesome. So I actually think, yep, we've spoken about everything. So which is great. I think I've covered most things that I had on these slides, anyway. So I suppose at the end of the day, I know this is definitely a bit nuanced with the use of medication. So it actually, it can help, to get, I suppose, into a calorie deficit, by managing hunger. But essentially, even still, for the most part, really restrictive diets, are only maintainable for, a certain amount of time. So, it's probably best to aim for more of a moderate calorie deficit that you can sustain, for longer. And those adaptations I mentioned earlier, where essentially your metabolism does start to adjust to a low intake. If it's a more of a moderate calorie deficit, that adaptation doesn't come, until a lot later. So you tend to see more sustained weight loss, although slower, but over a period of time. We spoke about, again, this is nothing lost on any of you here, adequate protein intake. So, during your weight loss journey, if we can preserve your muscle mass, then again, that's contributing to your metabolic rate. Obviously, the more muscle mass that we lose, naturally, the lower your basal metabolic rate will be, and subsequently your maintenance calories. Again, resistance training. So, I suppose, obviously, I'm not an exercise professional, but we can eat all the protein, in the world. And yes, that does help to preserve. But the key factor to essentially flick that switch, and go help the body preserve muscle mass is resistance training. So it needs that stimulus essentially coupled with, an adequate protein diet to maintain. So protein can't do all the, pardon the pun, I was going to say can't do all the heavy lifting on its own. It, generally can't do all the heavy lifting on its own. That's where resistance training comes in. Um, Look, sleep and stress management, that is again, a massive chat all on its own. But we know that sleep cycle, chronic stress has a big influence, on our hormonal sort of functioning, which ultimately plays into our metabolic rate. And what I tend to mention is consistency over perfection. Even throughout this journey, it's important to enjoy, your time. So, essentially, enjoying a small, moment of enjoyment. So if that looks like, for example, a chocolate or going out once a week with family, it's more important to have, for the most part, I'm speaking very generally here, but for the most part, to aim, that's where that can be a reality in more of a moderate, sort of calorie deficit. So you can enjoy, your process as well. So that is pretty much it from me.